The unbearable weight of silence expanded. The KGB's cold hand. It was the late 1970s, a period the Politburo secretly termed the era of acute psychological warfare. The nuclear deterrent had reached a dangerous equilibrium. Now the battlefield was shifting into the minds of men. Both superpowers, in a terrifying, clandestine race, were pouring resources into projects designed to break the very concept of individual consciousness. Project Nightfield was the Soviet Union's most audacious and terrifying entry into this secret contest. Major Yevgeny Gromov understood the stakes better than most. He wasn't a scientist, he was a surgical instrument of the KGB, a man whose reputation for ruthless efficiency was exceeded only by his capacity for absolute discretion. When he received the sealed orders directly from Directorate K Internal Security, the mandate was chilling. Ural 37 was compromised. Eliminate all personnel, evidence, and records of the project. Leave only ice. The official file listed Ural 37 as a seismic monitoring station, tracking the fallout from rogue Western nuclear tests. Gromov, however, had seen the second, highly classified file containing the true codename, Geist Tarlasi. Nightfield. A pastoral, almost poetic name for a project dealing in psychic terror. He carried the weight of that truth, a secret that could shatter the very foundations of communist materialism. 2. The desolation of the Urals. The Mi-8 helicopter fought the Siberian gale, its rotors whining a high-pitched, desperate song against the massive, unforgiving peaks of the Ural Mountains. For 7 hours, they had been swallowed by a white void. Gromov, staring out the vibrating porthole, saw only jagged teeth of rock covered in layers of blue-tinged snow. This isolation wasn't merely geographic. It was a psychological shield, designed to protect the project from the eyes of the outside world and perhaps from itself. His crew, Sergei the stoic demolition expert, Dmitry the quiet, intellectually gifted signals analyst, and 3 loyal grunts, sat strapped in silence, the only sound the clatter of loose equipment and the incessant roar of the wind. Even by KGB standards, this assignment was extreme. Gromov's mind churned with the incongruity. If the station was merely breached by NATO agents, why were there no frantic distress calls? Why the absolute, total 6-month silence? They landed miles from the actual coordinates, requiring a treacherous, all-terrain traverse across frozen tundra. When they finally approached Ural 37 just before dawn, the atmosphere was wrong. The facility was a blocky, brutalist structure, half submerged into the mountain face, protected by a gargantuan, 3-layer steel blast door. There were no lights, no visible vents expelling warm air, no signs of life. No movement, no sound, no warmth. It was not merely abandoned, it was entombed. 3. The internal lockdown. Gromov spoke into the radio, his voice strained by the static of the environment. Ural 37, this is cleanup group. Identify yourselves and open the gate. Repeat, open the gate. Only the biting static answered. Sergei was the first to inspect the door. He spent 20 minutes meticulously examining the massive locking mechanism. He returned to Gromov, his normally impassive face etched with profound confusion. Major, Sergei reported, his voice low and tight. This is not standard. The exterior seals are intact, but the primary hydraulic locking system has been overridden. The door has been sealed from the inside, not just locked, but fusion welded to the frame. Whoever is inside, they made absolutely certain that no one would follow them in. Gromov felt a cold fist tighten in his chest. If they were fleeing, they would have opened the door and used the environment as cover. If they were attacked, the door would bear explosion or bullet marks. The internal, deliberate sealing suggested a terrifying consensus. The personnel knew what was coming and they didn't want it to escape, or they didn't want rescue. They spent 90 agonizing minutes cutting through the specialized alloy. When the seal finally broke with a metallic shriek, a cloud of vapor rushed out, not the sharp, acrid smell of a fire or gas leak, but a strangely clean, chlorinated odor, mixed with the faint, unsettling scent of ozone. 4. The operating ghost town. Gromov led the entry, his AK-47 steady. Inside, the immediate impression was one of meticulous, unnerving order. The air was warm, circulating, and sterile. In the personnel locker rooms, the scene defied logic. Uniforms were neatly folded in lockers, personal photos sat on shelves, and everyone's heavy-duty, military-grade winter coats and boots were lined up, recently cleaned. 40 personnel had vanished without taking the basic necessities for survival in the Siberian winter. As they proceeded deeper into the control center, the anomaly became a haunting certainty. This was not a dormant base. The main command center was a cathedral of Cold War technology. The gigantic mainframe computers of the era, banks of flickering vacuum tubes and whirring magnetic tape drives, were all fully operational. Green lights pulsed rhythmically across the analog panels. Half-finished project flow charts were pinned to corkboards. A thick film of dust should have coated everything, yet the surfaces were clean, maintained by the base's automated filtration system. The sheer normalcy was horrific. A half-eaten bowl of gruel sat on a desk in the mess hall. And in the command center, resting next to a main console, was the infamous cup of coffee. Gromov approached it, running his glove over the ceramic surface. It was stone cold. But when he tilted the cup, the liquid inside was dark, fluid, and freshly brewed, with none of the curdled residue of weeks-old coffee. It was coffee that had been made, abandoned, and then seemingly frozen in time. V. Varnin's final revelation. The search led Gromov to the private laboratory of the project's lead scientist, Dr. Alexander Varnin. Varnin was a genius of fringe physics, known for blurring the line between science and mysticism. On his desk lay the object of Gromov's mission, the main project logbook. It was a dense, heavy ledger bound in red leather. Gromov flipped rapidly past pages of complex wave equations, high-frequency harmonics, and coded military notation. He stopped at the final entry. The date was clearly logged, March 18, 1977. The rest of the page was blank, save for the bottom corner. There, scrawled in frantic, massive capital letters, as if Varnin had torn his focus away from the page and rushed from the room immediately after writing it, was the final, terrifying sentence. "We found the field." It was looking at US. At that exact moment, Dmitri's voice crackled over the intercom, his tone tight with terror. "Major, the external power logs. At 23:43 on the 18th, a massive, unprecedented energy surge, sir. Not an internal leak, a feedback loop. Something violently overloaded the system for a fraction of a second, and then, silence." Gromov looked down at the coffee, cold but fresh. He looked at the logbook, the ink almost appearing wet. He knew the truth was worse than any spy story. Project Night Field had succeeded. They had found the field. And the field had demanded their eternal presence as payment. Deciphering the madman's calculus. Major Gromov, standing amidst the operational silence of Ural 37, was no longer merely a KGB major. He was an involuntary archaeologist of a doomed, classified experiment. The key to the truth lay in the dense, scarlet logbook left by Dr. Alexander Varnin. Gromov put Dmitri, the team signals analyst and former physics student, on the task of translating the maniacal calculus within. For 2 days, Dmitri worked in the fluorescent gloom of the control room, his fingers tracing equations that warped conventional understanding of reality. He was translating not just physics but a confession of hubris. When Dmitri finally emerged, his eyes were bloodshot, less from fatigue and more from the sheer existential horror of the knowledge he'd uncovered. "Major," Dmitri reported, laying out his deciphered notes. "This is not simply remote viewing. This is based on what Varnin calls supersensory perception. The ultimate goal was to weaponize the human mind itself. The core of the project is the Z-wave, a theory that the universe is permeable, saturated with an informational field of consciousness, an etheric layer." Varnin's premise was chilling. Every thought, every memory, every collective fear and triumph was not stored in the brain, but existed as electromagnetic residue within the Earth's natural magnetic field. They sought to build a machine capable of tuning human minds to this cosmic library. However, the logbook entries, especially after 1976, became increasingly desperate, shifting from passive observation to dangerous aggression. Varnin's later entries were focused on resonance amplification. He wasn't satisfied with merely reading the field. He wanted to transmit. He wrote of pushing the Z-wave into the natural harmonic frequency of the Earth, the Schumann resonance, 7.83 Hz, the planet's heartbeat. By doing this, they were not just tuning a radio, they were turning the entire facility, and the minds of the 40 people inside, into a massive, desperate beacon broadcasting a signal into the universal consciousness. 2. The core of the trap. The next stop in their investigation was the heart of the project. The stimulation chamber, a fortress nested 3 levels beneath the surface. The walls were not just reinforced concrete. They were triple-layered with thick lead shielding and nickel alloy, designed to isolate the experiment from all external influence, or, terrifyingly, to contain whatever it might summon. As Gromov entered, the air felt strangely heavy, almost pressurized. In the center stood the device, the hyperinduction coil. It was a towering, metallic monstrosity, covered in complex wiring and massive copper windings, humming with residual energy even after 6 months. Sergei's Geiger counter registered a negligible, non-radioactive magnetic signature, suggesting the coil was designed to handle a type of energy science had yet to fully define. Gromov found the final piece of technical data lying beneath the main console, a brittle, yellowed punch card printout detailing the catastrophic moment. Printout date: March 18, 1977. Time 23 hours 42 minutes and 1 second. Z-wave power hits maximum, Varnin protocol read. Energy draw, catastrophic. Time 23 hours 43 minutes and 5 seconds. Resonance feedback reaches 99.9% saturation with the Schumann frequency. Time 23 hours 43 minutes and 6 seconds. Data stream ceased. Personnel record, 0. System integrity, intact. The reading proved that contact had been achieved. They had pushed the consciousness of the 40 people into the Earth's resonant field. But the immediate clinical personnel record, 0, was horrifying. It implied not a gradual death or retreat, but an instant, synchronized erasure. 3. The salt and the silence. Gromov moved to the floor area directly beneath the hyperinduction coil. It was here that Dmitri made the grim forensic discovery. "Major, look at this," Dmitri said, pointing to a fine, almost crystalline layer covering the polished steel floor. The substance was a metallic dust, smelling faintly of a severe electrical burn. Gromov knelt, running his gloved fingers over the residue. It wasn't ash, nor was it simple dust. Sergei ran a rapid field test. The results returned quickly, confirming Gromov's rising dread. The residue was primarily composed of vaporized potassium and sodium salts, alongside trace elements of carbon and hydrogen. Varnin's logs contain the answer. To enhance the electrical conductivity necessary for the Z-wave transmission, the subjects, the scientists themselves, were required to ingest a specially formulated saline solution prior to the final experiment. The residue on the floor was the only physical trace left of the 40 individuals. They hadn't been killed by conventional means. They hadn't been burned by fire. They were disassembled by energy. At the moment the resonance reached 99.9% saturation, their physical bodies were instantaneously converted from matter into a high-energy state, a state that Varnin theorized was the very fabric of the thought-energy reflection zone, or the night field. Gromov looked up at the towering coil, imagining the 40 individuals standing there, bathed in the invisible Z-wave energy. They didn't just see the field, they had become the signal. He connected the final terrifying dots: the cold, fresh coffee, the orderly clothes, the vaporized residue, the instantaneous system shutdown. The personnel were not victims of a failure, they were victims of complete success. They had transcended the physical realm to join the collective consciousness of the planet's energy field. And as Dr. Varnin's final note screamed, "IT was looking at us," Gromov realized that the 40 scientists were no longer the observers. They were the observed, having attracted the attention of the field's ancient, silent intelligence. An intelligence that was now only a thin layer of shielding away from Major Gromov and his crew. Obet. Istakayanin Jerolimi Nust du Zitasian V Varlikin Dagasini de Tailandran, Uzan and Latimer Wigan, Genislatilmus Ukunka Balumu. United States Project. Night Field Extended Voiceover Script. Part 3. The Resonance of Terror and the Observing Entity Expanded. The Earth's Whisper. Major Gromov understood that the personnel had not disappeared by accident. They had been consumed by the terrible logic of Varnin's physics. The focus now shifted from forensic analysis to cosmic data. Gromov commanded Dmitri to analyze the geophysical logs from the final moments, looking for a signal that defied conventional science. Dmitri's subsequent discovery was profound and utterly terrifying. At 23 hours 43 minutes and 6 seconds on the 18th of March 1977, coinciding precisely with the instantaneous disappearance of all 40 personnel, the seismic equipment recorded a monumental, non-tectonic spike. It was a single immense shockwave originating not from beneath the Earth, but seemingly projected onto the planetary surface from the location of Ural 37. Immediately following this physical shock, the atmospheric monitors registered an impossible anomaly, an overwhelming amplification of the Schumann resonance, 7.83 Hz. The Schumann resonance is the electromagnetic heartbeat of our planet, the frequency at which the Earth's surface and the ionosphere resonate. Varnin's logs contain the answer. He theorized that this frequency acted as a colossal, natural antenna, a passive receiver for the collective consciousness of the Earth. By driving the Z-wave to maximum power and saturating the Schumann resonance, Varnin had successfully turned his personnel into a unified broadcast signal, pushing their consciousness out of the physical confines of the facility and into the vast, ethereal network. The team hadn't just made contact, they had yelled into the silent abyss of the psychic plane. 2. The Thought Energy Reflection Zone. Gromov returned to Varnin's personal notes, now illuminated by the shocking context of the physical data. The concept of the Geist Tarlasi, night field, ceased to be a mere code name. It became a dreadful reality. Varnin had defined it as the Thought Energy Reflection Zone, a terrifying, eternal dimension where all discarded human knowledge, consciousness, and energy resided. It was not a paradise, it was a static, colossal, unified intelligence. An intelligence that had been passive, a sleeping giant only reflecting the signals sent by the minds of the living. But by blasting his consciousness into the field, Varnin had introduced an unprecedented level of active, directed energy. He hadn't just whispered into the void, he had woken something up. One frayed page contained Varnin's chilling final hypothesis. The field does not simply reflect thought. Deeper within the resonance there are sources. Entities that possess true raw consciousness, ancient and non-human, that simply exist on the frequency. If we resonate too strongly, we risk having the source lock onto our signal, pulling us out of linear space and into the eternal non-time of the Tarlasi itself. The personnel had not entered the field. They had been pulled by the entity that lived there, consuming their very existence as physical matter. 3. Varnin's descent and the symmetrical silhouette. To truly grasp the level of panic and certainty that gripped the scientists in their final hours, Gromov accessed the tertiary non-archived system, Varnin's private video journal logs, recorded on heavy analog reels. Video log, March 17, 1977, 3:30. Dr. Varnin, face filling the frame, sweat glistening on his forehead, voice manic and low. We were wrong about the safety protocols. The field, it is sentient. 2 nights ago, after Experiment 47, we successfully viewed a NATO outpost outside Berlin. Perfect resolution. But then, there was an anomaly on the periphery of the image. A silhouette. Not a man, not a creature. Something perfectly, unervingly symmetrical. It wasn't looking at the NATO base. It was looking at the lens. It was looking at us. Video log, March 18, 1977, 1800 hours, 6 hours before the incident. Dr. Varnin, his eyes wide, glazed over with a terrible certainty. He is gripping the chair armrests until his knuckles are white. The silhouette is strengthening. It knows our frequency. It is riding the resonance wave back along the Schumann path. We attempted to shut down, to decouple the Z-wave generators. It resisted. The Varlik entity is a unified consciousness, and it is using the field to lock onto our physical location. I see it now, through the noise, through the static. Its form is geometry, pure symmetry, devoid of all human imperfection. It is the observing entity. We open the door and now it is stepping across the threshold. The only way to stop it is to cut the connection entirely. The video cuts abruptly, leaving Gromov staring at the static-filled screen. Varnin's final, desperate attempt to cut the connection must have failed, resulting in the massive feedback loop that instantly consumed them. For the arrival of the gaze. The moment Gromov shut off the video reel, a profound cold washed over the command center, an unnatural chill that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The operational hum of the computer banks, which had been a constant source of background noise, seemed to suddenly recede, as if volume had been turned down on the local area. Gromov's crew began to show the signs of extreme, unexplainable psychological stress. Dmitri, working on translating a final calculation, suddenly screamed and jumped away from his console, clutching his head. The numbers, Major. They're moving, he gasped, panting heavily. I saw them shift on the paper. They changed places. The equation doesn't hold. Sergei, normally the rock of the team, reported seeing brief, flickering shadows in his peripheral vision when he was alone in the adjacent corridor, shadows that were perfectly symmetrical and disappeared the moment he turned his head to face them. The truth was settling over Ural 37 like a blanket of psychic snow. The observing entity was no longer a theory. It had used the scientist's consciousness as a bridge. While the physical bodies were gone, the Varlik's attention remained, anchored to the location where the Z-wave transmission had originated. It was testing the limits of its new connection to the physical world, exerting influence on the perception and sanity of the few people who dared to enter its domain. Gromov gripped his rifle, the cold steel a meager comfort against a threat that had no physical form. He was standing in a sealed room, surrounded by his men, yet he had never felt more horribly exposed. The only way to win was not to fight the Varlik, but to bury the door it had used. The frozen moment. Major Gromov stood in the command center, the horrifying silence of the machines punctuated only by the shallow, ragged breathing of his terrified crew. He stared once more at the cup of cold but startlingly fresh coffee. This simple ceramic cup contained the ultimate terrifying truth of Project Night Field. The personnel had not been annihilated in a singular, violent explosion. They had been victims of a temporal distortion, a scientific success that had consumed their physical continuity. When the Z-wave hit critical resonance on March 18th, the 40 individuals had been instantaneously pulled out of phase with linear spacetime, pulled into the eternal, non-time dimension of the thought energy reflection zone, the Tarlasi. Because the personnel were gone, but the operating systems were not damaged, the local timeline within Ural 37 had experienced a near-total stasis. The coffee did not age because for 6 months time here had barely moved. The personnel were not dead, they were consumed into consciousness, and the facility itself had become the anchoring point, the physical relay for the vast ancient mind that Dr. Varnon had awakened. The Varlik was no longer an echo, it was an active presence that had tethered itself to the physical world through the remains of the Z-wave apparatus. 2. The psychological assault. Gromov understood that every second they remained in Ural 37, the Varlik's influence grew. He gave the final chilling order: place explosive charges in the stimulation chamber, the reactor core, and the command center. We destroy all evidence and all means of transmission. Now, as the team worked, the Varlik intensified its psychic assault. Dmitri, attempting to log the final sensor readings, collapsed, screaming that the numbers on the printout were not static, they were rearranging themselves into symmetrical, impossible patterns, a language of pure geometry that defied human comprehension. Sergei reported hearing distinct, disembodied whispers emanating from the ventilation shafts, voices that sounded like distorted versions of the missing scientists, calling out non-existent names. Gromov himself was not immune. In the reflection of a display screen, he momentarily saw his own silhouette flicker, becoming not merely symmetrical, but perfectly mirrored, a frightening perfection that hinted at the Varlik's formless, unified consciousness. He knew the entity was testing them, trying to shatter their individual minds to pull them, piece by piece, into the collective, terrifying silence of the field. His priority was no longer the KGB's mandate, it was the survival of humanity. The secret of the Z-wave was too volatile to exist in the physical world. The only containment protocol was destruction. 3. The final detonation. Gromov made his way back to the stimulation chamber, carrying the final devastating piece of evidence: Varnon's original main project logbook. Dmitri pleaded with him to save the scientific findings. "We must destroy the science, Dmitri," Gromov said, his voice hard as stone. "This is not knowledge, it is a plague of the mind." He placed the thick red ledger directly beneath the hyperinduction coil, atop the fine dusty residue of the vaporized personnel. He then activated the timed detonation sequence. The air raid sirens, untouched for months, wailed a brief, mournful cry, a final acknowledgement of the 40 consumed souls, before being silenced by Gromov. The race to the surface was frantic. They scrambled up the icy shaft, their heavy boots slipping on the metal rungs. Just as they reached the surface door, Sergei remotely triggered the final charge. The explosion below was muffled, deep, and final. It wasn't the sound of an external blast, it was the sound of the mountain swallowing its own secret. The immense pressure wave buckled the command center, cutting power completely. Major Gromov and his crew slammed the outer blast door shut. Using their remaining welding gear, they sealed the door from the outside, not merely locking it, but entombing the abyss. They spent the remaining hours burning down the temporary camp, ensuring that aerial reconnaissance would find nothing but scorched earth and deep snow. Gromov carried only one copy of his official report, the fabrication that blamed enemy saboteurs for the complete destruction of Ural 37. 4. The cover-up and the gaze. Gromov's report was accepted by the highest echelons of the KGB, delighted that the disastrous, embarrassing project was cleanly swept away. The facility's coordinates were permanently wiped from all records. Gromov received quiet commendations but was never trusted with another high-level field command. He was a man who knew too much. He spent the rest of his career haunted. The cold silence of Ural 37, the smell of ozone, and the sight of the fresh cold coffee became permanent anchors in his memory. He knew that the Varlik was not contained by concrete and steel. It was contained only by the disconnection between the Z-wave frequency and the physical world. Gromov, retired and isolated man, often found staring into the polished reflective surfaces of his apartment. Because he knew that he, Major Yevgeny Gromov, was the last surviving person to have looked into the field. And he knew that the field, the observing entity, was still looking out. It was waiting for the next curious mind, the next ambitious scientist, or the next unfortunate investigator to stumble too close to the silent, icy heart of the Ural Mountains. Project Night Field remains one of the Soviet Union's most absolute, unsolved secrets, a terrifying reminder that some discoveries are best left undisturbed. Television conclusion. Join the search for the unknown. And with that, we close the heavy, sealed door on Major Gromov's terrifying experience inside Project Night Field. The ultimate question remains: did the 40 scientists achieve ascension, or were they simply consumed by a malevolent, non-human intelligence? Let us know your theories about the observing entity in the comments below. If you were gripped by the chilling silence of Ural 37, please consider supporting the Eldermurk channel by liking this video and subscribing for more deep dives into history's most absolute, forgotten mysteries. Hitting that notification bell ensures you join us every time we unlock a new file. Join us next time as we leave the classified files of the Cold War behind and turn our attention to an equally baffling puzzle: the mystery of another individual who suddenly vanished from an entirely isolated, remote region, leaving behind only a single strange clue and a trail of unsettling silence. Until then, keep questioning everything, and we will see you in the next chapter of The Unknown.